Hi, good day, students, parents, guardians, and educators. I'm Jonathan Kressig, your host today. I'm the Director of Youth Services with Indiana Vocational Rehabilitation, and I'd like to welcome you to Pre-Employment Transition Services, or Pre-ETS for short, 101. This is really just a very basic presentation today, so I'm certain that you will probably have some questions by the end of this, and there is some contact information at the end of the presentation, as well as a couple of documents that are attached to the presentation that have my contact information, as well as Will Coltrion. He's the coordinator of youth services for VR. It has his contact information too. So feel free to reach out to us at our phone number, our email, or the Pre-ETS email that's at the end of this presentation. Let's see here. So this gives a kind of a basic overview of where Pre-ETS came from, where pre-employment transition services came from, why VR is offering these services, kind of a little bit of the history of pre-transition services. So it started through WIOA, otherwise known as the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. And that is a law that was signed into effect in July of 2014. And it replaced the Workforce Investment Act of 1998. And there was an increased emphasis on competitive, integrated employment for individuals with disabilities. So pre-employment transition services really expanded the depth of what VR is able to do and required to do. There's 5 focus areas, and that's kind of on the next slide, so I'll get into that here in a second. And it's for eligible students with disabilities, meaning students with disabilities who have already applied for vocational rehabilitation services and been found eligible. But how it really expanded what we do is that it's also available to students that we consider potentially eligible, students with disabilities. And I'll get into kind of the difference there in a second here. So VR is required to set aside 15% of our federal VR program funds. So we draw down about 80% of our funds from the federal government and about 20% from the state government. So 15% of that those federal program funds has to go to Pre-ETS and only Pre-ETS. And that's about $9 to $10 million a year to provide these pre-employment transition services to students with disabilities. So potentially eligible is defined as students receiving services under an IEP or students receiving services, accommodations under a Section 504 plan. So basically any students who have an IEP or have a 504 plan, or really any student with a documented disability would be eligible to receive pre-employment transition services. So as the name implies, potentially eligible students will not have applied and been found eligible for VR services. So here's the 5 required Pre-ETS activities. And what the federal law states basically is that we are required to make these activities available to students with disabilities throughout the state of Indiana. And again, I'll get into a little bit more about how we're doing that here in a second. But these are the 5 required activities through Pre-ETS, and they are job exploration counseling, work-based learning experiences, counseling on opportunities for enrollment in post-secondary education, workplace readiness, and instruction and self-advocacy. And you can see some examples of the activities that we can provide underneath each of these required activities. It's not limited to these are just some examples to kind of give you an idea of some of the things that we're able to do. And I'll kind of let you sort of read that on your own. And this PowerPoint will be available to you too also, so you can kind of review some of that. But these are the 5 activities we're required to make available to students with disabilities throughout the state of Indiana. So students and youth with disabilities, this is kind of what I call my confusing slide, but I think it's important because there's a difference here. And students with disabilities, so for Indiana, what that means is an individual with a disability in secondary or post-secondary education. So you have to have some type of disability and you have to be considered a student. In other words, you have to be enrolled in a secondary or a post-secondary institution. And you could be from age of 14. So Pre-ETS starts at age 14 through the age of 22. What that means is that up to the day the individual turns 23. So throughout the year that that individual is 22 years old, they would be eligible for pre-employment transition services. In federal law, it's a little bit different, but actually Indiana law is more inclusive. So we go with the more inclusive definition of what a student with a disability is. Youth with disabilities, on the other hand, is defined a little bit differently. So that's an individual with a disability who's age 14 through age 24, so again, up to the day they turn 25, and that individual may or may not be attending a secondary or post-secondary educational institution, but they would still be considered a youth with a disability. So here's the fun part. A student with a disability is always considered a youth with a disability, but not every youth with a disability is a student, right? Makes sense? Think about that for a second. So every student with a disability is a youth with a disability, but not every youth is a student because not every youth is enrolled in school, right? The reason this is so important that I'm sort of emphasizing this is that it's important for the provision of pre-employment transition services. Only students with disabilities are eligible. Youth who are not students should be referred to VR services, when it's appropriate to do that. So only students with disabilities are eligible for these services. Pre-ETS contracts. So this is sort of the major way that Indiana VR is providing pre-ETS throughout the state. We also have our youth counselors and our VR counselors throughout the state who do some of this also kind of as part of their regular work. But the main way that we provide pre-ETS throughout the state is through our contractors. We have 12 contractors providing pre-ETS throughout the state of Indiana, and they each have kind of their own catchment area throughout the state. They work with other providers, so there's greater coverage. So while there's 12 contractors, each contractor in general works with several other providers and kind of in collaboration with them so that we're able to reach all 92 Indiana counties. And at last count, we were in well over 400 schools throughout the state. And we've served thousands of students throughout the state at this point. We have 2 vendors. They're part of the 12 contractors who are slightly different, and that would require a whole other PowerPoint to kind of explain that. But and they're Hands in Autism and InSource. You may be aware of one or both of them. They provide specialized services that align with pre-ETS, so they're also contracted to provide that. And if you need more information on that, some of that is on the documents that are attached to this PowerPoint, and I can also provide further information on that if you want to contact me. So I wanted to discuss those 2 documents that I keep referring to that are attached to this PowerPoint. As you can see at the bottom of this PowerPoint slide, if you are able to click on that link, that will take you to these documents on the FSSA website. But again, for your convenience, they're also attached here. So the first handout that I'd like to talk about is called our Pre-ETS Basics handout, and it is very basic. It's 2 pages, and it gives a lot of the information I'm talking about today. So the first page just gives an overview of pre-employment transition services, or Pre-ETS. Again, it explains kind of where it came from, goes through the 5 core services, talks about the difference between a student and a youth with a disability, that kind of thing. If you turn that page over, you'll see that it also lists all of our contractors, the 10 sort of main contractors, and then the 2 contractors, InSource and Hands in Autism. Explains a little bit about what they do. It lists contact information for each of those contractors, and it also lists the counties that they are responsible for. So basically their catchment areas. So again, very basic, 2 pages. Most of our providers have taken this handout and kind of, changed it to kind of meet their own needs. But if you need information that you want to share with parents, teachers, students, this is kind of the basics that will help you kind of explain pre-ETS to those individuals or stakeholders. The other document is called our County Schools Providers document, and it is multiple pages. This just gives kind of a lot more details about our contractors throughout the state. So it's similar to the Pre-ETS Basics handout, but it's a lot more detailed. So not only does it list the contractor, it also lists who they're collaborating with, contact information. It lists, again, all the counties that they're involved in and each school that they are involved in each of those counties. So a lot more detailed information. So if you want to take that and use it to help enroll a student or to find out more information about kind of what's going on in your county or school, I would recommend that you use this form, this document, and contact the individual who serves your area or who serves your school. So hopefully that will be helpful to you. But those are the 2 basic handouts I wanted to kind of go over today. So enrolling in Pre-ETS. If you have a student who's interested in receiving pre-employment transition services or that you think would benefit from Pre-ETS, this is basically how you do it. Each provider is slightly different, but they all kind of use this as kind of the basis for enrolling students in Pre-ETS. So most providers take referrals from the school system. So they work with the schools on identifying which students they think would benefit from pre-employment transition services, which students may be already getting services through the school that are very similar to Pre-ETS, but maybe there's some other students who aren't getting those services and could really benefit. So they work with the school to kind of figure out who they want to identify as needing Pre-ETS within the school system. But if you have a student you believe would benefit from Pre-ETS, talk to your school personnel about a referral to the local provider. So if you have a student who maybe hasn't necessarily been identified by the school or the provider as needing Pre-ETS, but you think they could really benefit from that, we are not going to exclude them from pre-employment transition services. Talk to your school, talk to your local provider that's listed on that document that I just talked about, and we will get them enrolled in pre-employment transition services. So that's kind of the third bullet point. If you need assistance, contact the provider directly, use the Pre-ETS email at the end of this presentation. Feel free to contact me or Will, and we will help you through that. So what will happen then is that the provider will talk to the school and they'll let the school know, hey, this student is interested in receiving services, and they'll get information back from the school, including a release of information so that they can talk to parents, guardians, talk to the student, of course, and any disability documentation, an IEP, a 504 plan, or other documentation of disability. An intake at that point will be scheduled for the student, and then an intake rubric, or what we call kind of a Pre-ETS pre-test, will be administered. And that's just a way of us sort of figuring out where the student's strengths are, where their interests are, what their needs might be, and kind of set some basic goals so that it's individualized towards that particular student. So that'll be completed initially. And it's important to remember that the provider really can't work with a student until they have that release from the school and the disability documentation. But really, that's all we need in order to start working with a student. The release from the school so that we're able to talk to parents, guardians, and the student, and the disability documentation. And then they can begin working with the student at that point. So that's basically it. The final thing here is how to contact vocational rehabilitation. So information is available on our website if you just click on that link. And below that, you'll see an email that goes, that I get that directly. Will Coltrion, I mentioned earlier, the Coordinator of Youth Services, gets information from this email. So if you click on that and just send us an email, we'll contact you right away. Or again, feel free to use those 2 documents that are attached to this PowerPoint, and we'll get you taken care of. Thanks a lot, everybody. That's all I've got. I look forward to hearing from you.